This is Les Demoiselles d'Avignon by Pablo Picasso. Painted in 1907, this large oil painting is undoubtedly a 20th century masterpiece and, at least in my opinion, among one of the greatest works of art of all time. At first glance, it's hard to penetrate into the meaning of this square 8-foot by 8-foot canvas, which for many people offers no immediate answers as to why it should deserve such a significant place in the tradition of Western art at all, a position which is undeniably worthy of. The painting depicts 5 female prostitutes in a brothel. From personal accounts, we know that the young Picasso used to frequent a brothel on Carrer d'Avignon in Barcelona, which implies that the content of the painting is, at least partly, drawn from personal experience. And it's precisely this triumph of raw experience over formal mastery that, for me, makes the painting so special. In my opinion, what Picasso set out to achieve with Les Demoiselles was nothing less than a new way by which to capture the essence of a moment, to capture raw experience itself. To achieve this, the young Picasso would have to abandon centuries of tradition and invent an entirely new artistic language that would manifest itself most acutely in his first excursion into a proto-cubist style, a topic that we'll return to in a moment. If we take a closer look at the content of Les Demoiselles, there are a few things that strike me immediately about the painting. First of all, the painting conveys an almost palpable sense of violence and hostility in the way in which Picasso has rendered the women with jagged, angular shapes that depict the women in an almost disjointed manner. Huddled together, their sharp limbs jut out at each other like shards of broken glass. This effect led an early critic to describe the scene as naked women whose scattered parts are represented in all 4 corners of the canvas. Perhaps a fair enough assessment, but to my mind, this is the undeniable strength, not weakness, of the painting. What strikes me perhaps even more than the menacing tone are the women's transfixing eyes, which gaze out unblinkingly at the viewer. This gaze is emphasized by the almost exaggerated size of the women's eyes, and the clarity by which they're depicted in thick, dark pigment. It's critical to remember that nothing about this painting is accidental. Indeed, nearly 100 preliminary sketches of Les Demoiselles testify to Picasso's deliberation and meticulousness to arrive at his desired effect. Picasso's apparent spontaneity was as carefully orchestrated as in any other of his paintings. The painting's close resemblance to El Greco's The Opening of the Fifth Seal has been widely discussed by critics, who point out not only similarities in terms of composition and style, but also influences in terms of size and format, suggesting that Picasso may have consciously tried to evoke the apocalyptic power which El Greco depicts in his painting. The sketches show how Picasso altered the configuration of the painting several times, and show how the scene once contained 2 men as well as the 5 women. One, a sailor who sat in his uniform at the front of the painting, and another wearing a brown suit and carrying a book, who entered from the left, understood to be a medical student. What's clear about these 2 men is that they must have represented 2 different facets of Picasso's persona. The sailor, away at sea for extended periods of time, incarnates pure sexual lust, whereas the medical student would have appreciated the women more for their anatomical beauty. What this reveals about Picasso is a 2-tiered engagement with the women, his sexual attraction towards them as a man, and his keen interest in their form and anatomy as an artist. Picasso could view his subjects with an analytic eye, but as we know from his personal life, he also had sex with his muses too. Picasso doesn't deny this attitude, yet the omission of the men means that a void is opened up for the women's attention to fall elsewhere, beyond the painting, to include the viewer in the scene. Although the women, wrapped in billowing curtains and bedsheets, may seem like a traditional subject, Picasso has turned tradition on his head in Les Demoiselles, and what he achieved in the process paved the way for the advent of Cubism and heralded the beginning of modern art as we know it. It's easy to overlook the enormous and shocking impact that such a rupture with tradition had at the time. But for many, Les Demoiselles was deemed immoral, with even Picasso's closest friends, among them Georges Braque, who he would later co-invent Cubism with, expressing their shock and outrage at the painting. Critics even went as far as arguing that the work has simply been left unfinished. a view that isn't shared by the consensus of art historians nowadays. For these reasons, Les Demoiselles wasn't publicly exhibited until 1916, almost a decade after its completion, and the work's true significance wasn't fully understood until the early 1920s, when the French poet André Breton published the work and described the painting as the core of Picasso's laboratory, a comment referencing the alchemic nature of Picasso's experimentation. This experimentation and eventual rupture with tradition is no more heavily embedded into the painting than through Picasso's use of old as well as modern pigments in this very creation. Yet, for such a revolutionary painting, Les Demoiselles is indebted to and was constructed in direct response to the artistic tradition that preceded him. If we were forced to isolate a moment that perhaps prompted the conception of the painting, then it would perhaps have to be Picasso's visit to the 1907 Cézanne exhibition in Paris. It was at this exhibition that Picasso saw Cézanne's Large Bathers for the very first time. Large Bathers, completed in the year prior to Cézanne's death, set the bar for emerging young artists like Picasso and Matisse, who were out to make a name for themselves and who would strive to outrival each other in the process. The first response to Cézanne's masterpiece came in the shape of Matisse's Bonheur de Vivre, itself a masterpiece that drew upon its source, but went a step further in its experimental and unexpected use of colour that sought to arouse an emotional response by abandoning a faithful representation. The painting was met with immediate praise, and this only compelled Picasso further to outcompete his rival. Picasso responded with Les Demoiselles d'Avignon, which he originally named Le Bordel Philosophique, the philosophical brothel, a response which grew naturally out of his rivalry with Matisse and set him on a collision course with tradition. If we compare both artworks, we can see how Picasso drew a lot of inspiration from Matisse's painting, but what's most illuminating for me are the ways in which the two paintings fail to overlap. If we examine the paintings more closely, we notice that, although they both deal with themes of sexuality, Picasso's rendition is by far more aggressive and crude, and speaks less to a sense of sensuality than does Matisse's. This is visible in the squatting figure in the bottom right corner of the painting, and the aggressive stance of the women who crouch inward towards the center of the painting. In stark contrast, Matisse's subjects are curvy and ooze a sensuality expressed vividly in soft pink and yellow hues. There is hardly a sharp line to be seen in Matisse's painting, and his subjects enjoy plenty of open space and almost meld with the idealized dreamy landscape that befits them. Picasso's vision, on the other hand, is menacing, with the whole scene condensed inside a small room barely big enough to contain them. Indeed, the whole representation is overbearing. Even the draping fabrics have corners that seem sharp and jagged. For Picasso, this sexual experience may indeed be overbearing for the customer, who is subtly implied to be us, the viewer, through the careful arrangement of the prostitutes and other elements in the scene. By depicting the prostitutes in such a menacing way with transfixing gazes, Picasso, in a move echoing Manet's Olympia, turned centuries of tradition on his head that would have allowed the viewer free rein to indulge in the sexuality of the prostitutes, whose heads would have been coyly turned to the side, allowing the viewer to enjoy the scene without any implicit judgment. In Picasso's scene, however, the observer becomes the customer at the brothel, as well as the object of the women's attention, creating an almost overbearing sensation of innocence and an overwhelming feeling that must have accompanied the young Picasso on one of his early visits to a brothel as a boy. Indeed, critic William Rubin argues that, although the painting is a clear expression of desire, its menacing nature also points to Picasso's deep-seated fear of contracting sexual diseases like syphilis. So, where does Picasso's painting derive such a crude sexual potency? We don't need to look far to see that based on the faces of the women, the Picasso delved deeply into ancient or more primitive artistic styles in his quest, as he put it, to liberate an utterly original artistic style of compelling, even savage force. If we take a look at the three women on the left, we can see how their facial features resemble those found in the ancient Iberian style of Picasso's native Spain. If we take a look at the two figures on the right side, however, we notice that their faces exhibit more African mask-like features. Picasso would also have been inspired by Gauguin's Oviri, which was inspired by non-Western art. For Picasso, the aim of this appropriation was to conjure an almost primal force of sexuality that was somehow timeless in its racial primitivism and that would be able to unlock a potency appropriate for this scene of raw experience. This savage force was also a common motif in the work of painters that Picasso admired, seen most notably in Henri Rousseau's The Hungry Lion Throws Itself on the Antelope, and other Fauvist depictions. Fauvism, from the French for wild beast, was an artistic movement concerned with vivid, expressionistic and non-naturalistic use of colour. As art critic Hilton Kramer put it, Les Demoiselles was an assault upon the tradition from which it derived. But Picasso was far from finished with his assault on tradition. In his first step towards a proto-cubist style, Picasso marked a departure from one-point perspective toward a new experimental way of rendering objects in space. This style, which he would develop alongside Georges Braque, would come to be known as Cubism and marked a seminal moment on the path toward modern art. Early excursions into a proto-cubist style can be seen in the way in which the picture plane has been flattened. Looking at the scene, it's difficult to know for sure whether the top left woman is in line with or behind the two central figures, or whether or not the crouched figure in the bottom right is positioned in the foreground. The painting does give some indication about the relative position of each woman, but nothing seems certain, and some critics even suggest that one of the women may even be lying horizontally on a pillow and not standing upright as we first expect. With Cubism, objects are broken down and reassembled in a way that encourages us to view them from multiple viewpoints, so that we can almost enter into the painting and look around or behind an object and experience the scene in a more direct and lifelike manner. With this in mind, Picasso's bold desire to capture the very essence of a moment, its rawness, its immediacy, and to compact that moment into a two-dimensional image for all eternity, broke him off from the tradition and set him on a trajectory towards becoming perhaps the greatest artist of all time.